So the question is, Laughing Man asks that they felt that the Phyrexian multiverse invasion was resolved very poorly. How do I feel about the resolution to the Phyrexian problem? And sorry, I am jet lagged and sleep deprived from my daughter also being jet lagged up. So in general, when people talk about this kind of thing, they're talking about a couple different but related things. There's the actual plot itself. There's the writing of the story. Those are two different things. And then there's the space or budget for that story. Now, here's what I'll say about it. I think there are a lot of very valid criticisms of the whole Phyrexian arc from a year or two ago. Not all of them, but generally the constructive ones were genuinely pretty good criticisms. And I think when you sort of boil down the various criticisms, a lot of it comes down to people wanted more from that story in terms of more stories, like more episodes. The other challenge with talking about this is that in the Magic community, we're often talking about different things when we're talking about a story. The majority of Magic players are not necessarily reading the web fiction. They are getting the story from the card sets themselves. So when you have a discussion about something like this, you also run into the issue of what level of story is someone operating on. Like, have they only seen the card set and they wanted more from the card set? They wanted another set entirely, even outside of what that would mean in terms of more episodes? Have they only had the story retold to them at a local game shop? Have the more story oriented person in their friend group tell them what happened? Have they read summaries and listened to like podcasts or YouTube videos or my TikTok about it, but not read the actual stories? These are all perfectly fine, by the way. No one has to actually read all the Magic stories. But it does present a challenge when trying to discuss stuff like this. So with all that out of the way, let me discuss this from a couple different angles that I've seen people talk about it and tend to conflate with each other. I can absolutely see where people are coming from when it comes to like, they felt March of the Machines resolved things too abruptly. You know, story-wise, Phyrexia All Will Be One was meant to be the nadir of the story, and then things start getting better. But I can absolutely see the thinking that things wrapped up too quickly. And in terms of like story count, I'm always in favor of more story. March of the Machines alone had about a novel's worth of story. It was about 100,000 words in short stories. But for the scale of this, I could absolutely have seen it going higher if there was like budget for it. Now, if we're talking about the plot itself, there are a couple elements I've typically seen people talk about. The first is like the deaths of the Praetors, and I think the Praetors sort of have an outsized influence in the Magic cultural zeitgeist compared to how much of a character any of them really are, if that makes sense. And I think the story wisely uses its time to focus on the heroic characters, on Elspeth's change, on Chandra's pathos, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean I don't wish we could have gotten like a Theros side story as well, or more side stories focusing on the downfalls of individual Praetors, but the space is what it is. The last bit is sort of how it was concluded, and that is with like the Phyrexians everywhere, sort of the oil having like a failsafe that basically kills the Phyrexians that were invading everywhere. And that's really just, there are two things going on there. First, that is more or less how the first Phyrexian invasion ended. The Phyrexians pretty much all just gave up when Yawgmoth died because they were all tied to him. It was very much building Elesh Norn in that way to be paranoid and ensure that Phyrexia can't continue without her if someone betrays her again. But also narratively speaking, it's just a very common trope. It happens all the time in fiction. Whenever you have this giant army, they need to be dealt with somehow, but there's not always space for it. The Hobbit kind of gets around this by knocking Bilbo out, and they skip the whole battle. The Hobbit, the novel, I should mention. The 3 movies certainly added a lot there. I also think people sort of overestimate how much the general public wanted more Phyrexian stuff. Like 4 sets almost fully focused on Phyrexian horror. It was not as popular as the online community probably thinks it is. Like, there's a reason Duskborn is right next to Bloomborough. Like, people need palate cleansers between these kinds of darker, more horror-oriented stories. Now, if you're talking about after effects of the invasion, I think people are underestimating just how much the entire narrative is driven by the scars of the invasion right now. Like, Duskmorn is the Wanderer searching for Nashi in a house of horrors because why? Why might the Wanderer feel super obligated to go help Nashi? Could it be because she killed Tamio? Even though Tamio was completed at the time, and then they learned later maybe Tamio could have survived. But to plainly answer the question, the short version before I log off this one is, do I think things could have been done better? Yeah, of course. I think almost everything, even the stuff I love, I always think there's room for improvement. But I think the things it did well, it did really well, and the things it didn't do well generally came down to, I wish there was more story for it. Anyway, please be normal in the comments about this. We can have a constructive conversation without having to talk about how everything sucks, you know.